Hello and welcome. I'm Jacquelyn Sundberg and I work with the ROAAr group here at the McGill Library. That stands for Rare Books and Special Collections, the Osler Library of the History of Medicine, the Visual Arts Collection, and Archives and Records Management. We welcome speakers from McGill, Montreal, and beyond, and tonight our guest Andrew Steeves is joining us from Kentville, Nova Scotia. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. And this is what's coming up. We'll have an introduction to some of the ROAAr collections from librarian Anne-Marie Holland, and we'll have the main portion of the event with Andrew Steeves and Lauren Williams, and we'll have an open Q&A where I will be voicing your questions on your behalf, and we'll have a live discussion where Andrew and Lauren will be answering those questions. So before I do go further as well, there's one other very important piece of business. That's up next. Actually, that's for the end. And I'll just stop the share here. But I just want to take a moment to think through where I am joining you from, because today, myself, Anne-Marie, and Lauren, we are all on site on the downtown campus of McGill, and we're in the McLennan Library building. And this building is situated on land that has long served as a place of meeting and exchange amongst nations. Those nations include the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. ROAAr honors, recognizes, and respects these peoples as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which McGill stands today. And it really is a privilege to meet on this place and to share ideas and to exchange ideas, especially when we get to tune in to people from wherever you are and from far, like Andrew, this evening. So let me introduce our first speaker, Anne-Marie Holland, who you see on screen. She's the curator of the William Colgate History of Print collection, and she's going to give us a brief introduction to some of the relevant things and the treasures that we're going to hear about today. And following Anne-Marie, we're going to pass the microphone to Lauren Williams, librarian and curator of the Black Wood collection here at McGill. Before coming to McGill, she did spend 5 years as a printing and bookbinding assistant in the Massey College bibliography room. She, along with Anne-Marie, are part of the team that powers our book arts lab. So Anne-Marie, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you. I'm going to be giving a few notes on type specimens this evening as a relevant topic for Andrew Steeves, and just giving you a little bit of a preview of the Colgate collection. I'm actually in the Colgate room. Established in 1956, the William Colgate History of Printing collection promotes an appreciation for both the physical and aesthetic qualities of printed material. Housing more than 14,000 items, the collection has developed over half a century into one of the most comprehensive collections of its kind in North America. It documents the evolution of technology and practice of printing. So I'll share a little bit of the screens I have on our collection. I'll just make sure that's full view. Okay. So here I'm showing you a portrait of William Colgate by Evan MacDonald. It's a fine oil painting, probably accomplished in the late 1930s. There are not very many portraits of William Colgate, who was the founder with William Pennington of this very collection. The oil painting was generously donated in 2000 by Mrs. Constance Colgate Wallace, the daughter of William Colgate. And it now has a place of honor at the entrance to the Colgate seminar room, where I am sitting presently. So I wanted to talk about the Colgate collection in particular. Of the 10 sections that define this collection, an important strength is the vast range of examples of type specimens rarely held in other collections, exemplified by over 1,600 type founders and printers' specimen sheets, booklets, and catalogs. You've already heard that one of the special attractions of the Colgate History Collection are the 5 historical iron hand presses, including the mighty Columbian hand press dating back to 1821, now fully restored. This press connects intimately to the Colgate collection, the printed collection, and to these type specimens. So besides printing presses, related tools of the trade, and shop equipment, a printer's arsenal included a vast array of typefaces in Roman, italic, and black letter, measuring different point sizes, cut in metal or made of wood in order to meet the needs of any one print publication. And to give you a taste of what these are, I have the William Caslin, part of the William Caslin specimen sheet up. It shows some of the remarkable fonts and sizes from 1734 specimen sheet. So we also have designs by 18th century French masters such as Pierre-Simon Fournier and the Didot dynasty. And they coincide with all of these English houses that are continued throughout the 19th century. Coined the king of typographers and the typographer of kings, Italy's foremost designer Bodoni was so preoccupied by the function of typography that he created a manual to demonstrate principles of excellence in design. And just letting you know that the Book Arts Lab owns a good supply of Bodoni typefaces in various point sizes. And I think Lauren might refer to them at some point tonight. So turning now to Canada, let's see. Collecting over the past several years has centered on Canadian content across the spectrum of the book arts in order to represent a comprehensive view of this nation's historical and contemporary print culture. For designers needing to respect historical accuracy in their current work, our holdings have proved essential. For instance, specimen books like the one issued by the Montreal Type Foundry in 1865 have proved to actually help them design types that are specifically requested to be Montreal specific. So the type in Canada was first cast by the Montreal Type Foundry in the 1830s. Up to 1867, the Montreal Type Foundry acted as an agent for two of the most important wood type makers, Wells and Webb and W.H. Page. So moving on to the Levels and Gibson Printing Office, sheets of specimens that were issued in 1846, such as these examples by the Levels and Gibson Printing Office, were probably furnished by the Montreal Type Foundry. So there's a long history after the Montreal Type Foundry disappeared around 1874. It was succeeded by the Dominion Type Foundry, and it continues on through to the Toronto Type Foundry, etc. There's a long history on type specimens in Canada. I just wanted to show you a few of the recent requests that I've had from international researchers consulting our specimens, and during the pandemic, I needed to supply these by online versions. So you see an example of from the Amsterdam Type Foundry, supplied the Primula ornaments booklet for the researcher out in the United States. And we also just dealt with Paul Shaw, who's working on the Futura type of the Bauer Type Foundry. And this is about a 1931 specimen sheet, but he's working with us to maybe even define those dates a little bit better. So now we're on to our Canadian designers. And before we go to Andrew Steeves, I would just like to remind you that the William Colgate History of Printing Collection is the major repository in Canada for the work of Robert R. Reed, the pioneer and now one of the most acclaimed typographers and book designers in Canada. His ephemera and job printing number over 700 pieces in the Colgate collection. Robert Reed is truly an extraordinary talent in book design, graphic design, typefaces, page layouts. We cherish his work and his continued digital designs. In addition, the most recent crowning accession of a typography's archive is that of the celebrated Canadian letterpress printer and typographer Glenn Goluska. He sadly departed in 2011. So active in the 70s, the 80s, 90s, and into the early 2000s, Goluska, over the course of his career, established 2 private press houses and created visually compelling graphic designs and letterpress productions. Our archive includes his private press productions from Toronto and Montreal years, commercial jobbing printing, and designs in his role as chief graphic designer for the Canadian Centre for Architecture here in Montreal. So we welcome you to look at both of those archives. And tonight, we welcome from the Gaspereau Press co-proprietor Andrew Steeves, a prolific Canadian editor, publisher, writer, typographer, and letterpress printer, operating in our midst today from Kentville, Nova Scotia. Among the more than 150 editions that we own across the McGill library system, and I invite our audience to explore the company that Andrew Steeves keeps: poets, literary critics, type designers, printers, engravers. I just wanted to point out the last purchase we made for the Colgate collection here in Rare Books. So the work is entitled, as you see there, and I'll probably not do this very well in Latin, Literarum ex arboribus, an exuberant showing of the wood type at Gaspereau Press. It was delivered during the precarious period of the pandemic in the summer of 22. It was hard to forget those days. And in my view, it is a typographically uplifting book which features a supply of over 150 fonts of wood type in the cases at Gasboro Press. So there is a nice connection here to our collection as it integrates wood type formerly used and collected by Glenn Goluska. Published in a limited edition of 26 copies, we were lucky to acquire number 16. We got it very early on. We welcome you to see this work. There's much more to it. It is folio size, printed in colors on Mohawk superfine paper, hand sewn and quarter bound by Don Taylor, and placed in a handmade wooden box upon which is affixed the letter P. That was our choice, P for printing, of course, displaying one of the wood type fonts. The messages used to display in this work were very witty, and I loved going through this work just for the color, the designs, the types of wood fonts. And many students, we've used these in classes already, were drawn to this work as they were learning about wood types on 18th and 19th century playbills. So thank you very much, Andrew Steeves, for producing this fine work and making connections for us to our collections. Now let's turn our attention to the main event, a conversation on the technique and process of typographical design and printing between two masters of the trade. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anne-Marie. I certainly don't think I could be called a master yet, still on my learning journey, but I appreciate the kind words. And I think Anne-Marie did a really great job of introducing Andrew and his work, but I also just wanted to mention that most recently your collaboration with Alexander MacLeod on his book, Lagomorph, won the Nova Scotia Masterwork Arts Award, so congratulations on that.
Well,
and just to give everyone a little bit of context, I met Andrew when I was a volunteer at the Massey College bibliography room, where they house at least 6 historic presses and hundreds of drawers of wooden and metal type. And I think Andrew would make an almost yearly trip to Massey to study, you know, the book design examples that they have there. They have a wonderful sort of fine printing and illustration collection of books at Massey. And during one of his visits, I was just starting a printing project, and I was a bit dismayed to find that the only paper that we had on hand was this very sort of abrasive bright yellow. And I was about to abandon my project, but Andrew intervened and said, oh, well, you know, you could think about experimenting with your ink colors. And I think he recommended that I try using white ink or some bright orange. And I think I was a bit taken aback by the loud color combinations, because I think up until that point, I'd only ever printed using black or dark brown ink. But I'll always remember that interaction because it completely changed the way that I approach matching ink with paper. And so this is the kind of hands-on practical instruction and guidance that we hope to eventually provide to students and volunteers in the McGill Book Arts Lab, which you can see behind me here. And we think that giving students the opportunity to do some actual letterpress printing on presses like the Columbian that you can see will be an incredible supplement to, for instance, studying the type specimen books that Anne-Marie talked about. And so we thought, who better to invite tonight to talk to us about printing than Andrew. So thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's great to be here. Well, here and there.
And
whatever
so,
this is.
one nice thing about the pandemic is that we can actually do these kinds of events much more easily than having to trek you out to Montreal in person. And I just wanted to also mention, maybe as a bit of an entree into our conversation, that you have a personal connection to Glenn Goluska. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your relationship with him? And I believe some of his equipment is in your shop as well.
Yeah, I mean, Glenn is one of those people that, was an indirect influence. Like I didn't, when I started doing what I was doing, I didn't see Glenn's work and identify Glenn's work and say, I should do work like that. But it was more that as I was finding my way and figuring out, how to design books, how to print, that when I sort of looked up from that toil and looked around, I noticed people who were doing the same thing. And Glenn was one of them. We just have a lot of sympathy between our interests and styles. And even though there was, was much older than I was and grew up in a different context. And we were still influenced by the same things. And the journey I was on was not unlike the journey that he had taken, 20, 30 years earlier. And so we got to know each other kind of already as colleagues. But Glenn didn't have children, and he really wanted his equipment to go somewhere, not to be broken up, but to go somewhere where it would be used, like to make stuff. And it's often a gamble with institutions. Some of them really embrace it and they put this stuff to work, and some of them kind of just sort of tarp it and take care of it and keep the rain off it, but not much happens. And so he was really set on it coming here. And so we had made this informal arrangement, that when he was done printing, that I would take his linotype, take his press, take his wood type, and take, there was, I think something close to 400 cases of type all told. And yeah, it was no small job. And then Glenn went and died on me, which was not the plan. I mean, so what was supposed to be something that would happen later in my own career happened way too soon, because given the choice, I'd rather have Glenn than his stuff. Right. And I miss him dearly. But and it often occurs to me as I'm printing that, if I pull off a particularly good page or something, and I sort of get excited and you kind of click your heels, so to speak, and the person you want to show it to is, well, it's Glenn, right? And he's not here, so it happened too early. But we did arrange the move. I went up with a neighbor friend and my oldest boy, and we moved all the equipment from Montreal down here to Nova Scotia. And I figured out how to run the linotype, which had no meaningful tutelage in, and away we went. So yeah, that's my collection with Glenn. He was a lovely person and a really very original printer, and yet he wasn't a showy printer. He was, as a designer, he had a very distinctive style. He was always doing Glenn, but he could do Glenn in many, modes.
Versatile Glenn. And well, speaking of book design, that's sort of a nice segue into one of the questions that I wanted to start off by asking you tonight. In 2014, you wrote and published a book called Smoke Proofs, which is a series of essays in which you think about publishing, literary publishing, printing, and book design in Canada. And one of my favorite parts of that book is in the introduction, where you explain that people often tell you that you make beautiful books. And you explain that to some people, your production values represent something extraordinary. And if you'll allow me to quote from you, you suggest that, quote, a society that elevates basic craftsmanship to a position akin to magic is a society that's functioning outside the sphere of human definition, meaning, and responsibility. And so it seems as though you have a very strong reaction to this idea of people perceiving your books as beautiful. Could you explain a little bit what you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. That's a very Wendell Berry kind of sentence I was written that. Yeah, a lot of what's gone off the rails, in our society, and it has been a problem, for a long time. Where it's not unique to our time, but I can only talk about it in our time. And what I see as being off the rails very often is this idea that to do well or at anything is extraordinary, outside of the realm of the everyday. And so we're surprised by kindness, and we're surprised by, if you buy a refrigerator and it lasts more than 5 years, you're like, oh, well, this is a very good refrigerator. Like our expectations have really dropped, about what, I still use tools that were my grandfather's. And they were built without, a computer aided design and the best steel or whatever. They were made in more primitive ways, but they were made to last. They were not made to fail after 5 years or whatever. So you'd have to buy another one. So when people talk about beauty, they're often using I think it's a genuine reaction when you see something that's well made and thoughtfully made, that we often, that's the part of it that we most easily interact with, we can see and identify. It's harder to identify, oh, I noticed that the grain of the paper goes the right way. Oh, or I noticed that you've made a particularly good matching of these two, ink tones, or like, no, people have a general reaction, and that reaction is, this is beautiful. And because it's a shorthand, it doesn't really cover the territory as well as it should. And we allow it, we turn it into a kind of, we start to think about design as a bedazzling things, making them special and putting the sparkles on them or whatever.
Right.
But design is about function ultimately. It's you can go to the dollar store and buy a hammer for $2 or something, with a pink handle, and is that design? Is that beautiful?
Right.
Is that, like, what matters is how the balance of that tool and how it works and what you do with it. That's where beauty resides, is in function. So I often refer, or compare making books to like hanging a door. Like if you do a good job hanging a door, and it opens and closes, and it's everything's plumb, and then no one notices. The door just does its job forever and ever. It was really nice when Alex and I won the Masterworks Award here in Nova Scotia, and it's a funny prize because it's multidisciplinary. So we were in finalists with a sculpture, a piece of public sculpture, and a gallery installation, and this really incredible drag queen / anime / lip sync theater piece, and our quiet little classical book, that compared to, say, the wood type specimen that I did, is like behaves itself so well. It does not jump up and down and scream and call attention to itself. It's a very quiet classical book. And so the notion that something like that, can win a prize against all of these more, in some ways, animated things, was very gratifying to me, because it means that well-hung door is still valued.
Mm. I know that certainly in my generation, and perhaps the generations younger than me, I grew up with a lot of sort of cheap and mass-produced things, plastic toys that fall apart after a couple of weeks. And there wasn't, certainly in my childhood, an emphasis on well-made objects. And so I find often with people my age, we almost have a nostalgia for something that we never experienced ourselves, because now you see people going out and spending $50 on a wooden bowl that's made from reclaimed wood from a barn or something, which I think it just speaks to the trendiness of this idea. But it makes me wonder whether perhaps the reason why people interpret your books as beautiful is an appreciation of the labor involved in creating them, because they can tell just by looking at it that this is something that's handmade, that wasn't created on a computer.
Yeah, I suppose that's part of it. Some of our work is created on a computer, but it's created on a computer with a knowledge of the materials. So much design that happens now is, people are, a designer sits in their apartment or their office, and they've never smelled ink. They don't know one type of paper weight or from another. They've not. They don't have that knowledge. It just looks good on the screen, and they send the PDF off, and that's the end of their interaction with the process. So I think when things are made by people who are interested and curious about and engaged with all the materials, including the human materials, and in my case, I'm editing the books, I'm selecting the books, I'm working with the authors, and then I'm trying to solve the riddle of how to present that thing to the world, and then how to express that in you know, inevitably flawed materials, as all materials are. Everything has their limits, right? Everything on the planet has its limits. So, you know, when you bring all those together, it makes it, whether you call it beauty or you call it fitness to purpose, whatever it is, it's certainly increases the chances that you can make something that works properly. And like, did you grow up in your house? Was it common to make, I mean, for anyone to make anything? Like, did you make anything great? Like, surely you baked some cookies or something. At least, and you must have changed a tire at some point. Or
Yes, although, and certainly, you know, when I was a kid, my mom was sewing our Halloween costumes by hand and things like that. But unfortunately, I think given the society that existed at the time, that still exists, as a kid, we always wanted the fancy store-bought Halloween costume and not the one that mom sewed for us. So I think
that's the whole classic post-war problem, that would suddenly, like, no one wanted, you know, your grandmother's canned peaches. They wanted the peaches from the store.
But it's interesting
because somehow it seemed, and it's funny. I mean, that's not easily escaped, that thinking. I still look at my books and think, I made that. It's homespun, right? Like, I see myself, you know, and I think that ultimately that's a good thing. But from my own perspective, it's like looking in the mirror. You see yourself and you're like, I don't know. But when I see like the latest forgettable thing from Random House, I go, you know, that's often very poorly made. I think, oh, well, there's a real book. Like, it's not, you know, like, because it's someone else made it. It's made by a machine, you know. And so that's very common, you know, that sensibility.
Right. And so I know that you often host visits for student groups from local universities and high schools at your print shop. Can you give us a sense of, you know, what's the reaction from young people who come into your space and who, when they start to understand what it is you do?
I think there's almost always that idealistic kind of eye-popping kind of, there's just, I mean, you know, it's just a lot of drawers of stuff. Like, there's everywhere you look, there's something that seems straight out of, you know, the late 19th century. Like, and a lot of it is. So you get that kind of just like, I think it's pretty obvious when people come in that they get the sense that cool things happen here. And they don't necessarily sense like all the behind the scenes work that goes into it, but there's a kind of energy, you know, that I think students always have when they come in. And one of the things I'm always trying to do, you know, whether it's you know, English or journalism students, or whether it's design students, or whether it's printmaking students, or anybody else. I mean, like, the real job is trying to entice them, you know, off the path, you know, like to corrupt them in some way, into believing that they can do things, like that they can make things, that they don't need to wait for permission from somebody. Like, if they're curious enough and they're observant enough and they are persistent, then they can do things. And that seems to be, I don't know where somewhere between like learning to walk and graduating with master's degrees, we seem to like take that out of people. So they're looking for a like, you know, what program should I sign up for? What should I, you know, it's like, no, just, I mean, some of that stuff's good, or depending on who you are, but like just do something, like try something.
And it must be, I certainly get this a lot from students who come into the Book Arts Lab. You know, the first thing is just shock, like, who knew that people still could print on machines like this? But then when I explained that there are people in Canada and in the rest of the world who print books on machines like this, they're just, their jaws drop. And the most common question is this actually a job that people could do? And I think even beyond that, so often young people today are convinced that doing anything artistic or anything, even sort of craftsmanship type careers, are not considered, are not as strongly considered as perhaps they have been in the past. And so I think a lot of the time younger people don't even think about the fact that they could be an artist or a printer or something like that. And so is there a bit, are people surprised to see that you're able to make a living doing this, and does it make them want to pursue something similar?
Again, I think they think it's magic or luck or talent or something like that, as opposed to having made a decision and persisted. You know, I'm not an untalented person. I would not sort of fake that kind of modesty, but you know, that's such a small portion of the equation.
Right.
Like it's the last, I don't know, 5% something like, and the rest is, you know, just work. Like it's showing up and doing it. It's persistent. It's well, and the other piece is we have to, lots of people, and I'm sure you've seen this, you know, among people that you saw come through at Massey College's print shop and so on. You know, lots of people get excited about the stuff and then they dabble a little bit, and they print something and the lights go off in their head. And then they want to print, but they don't know what to print, right? Like they don't, like, so underlying all of it has to be this fundamental question of what is this for? Like, how does this connect to my community? What is it? What do I do with this? And if you don't answer that question, you're just doodling. And, you know, that's fine. But if you want to have a sort of career in this, if you really want to employ this in some way, you have to figure out what you're employing it for. Who are you serving? You know, you can't make a thing. You can't design a thing if you don't know its application. I mean, you can, but it will just be a bauble, right?
Right.
So and the other thing I often encounter with people, younger people especially, but not exclusively younger people, would be this whole problem of wanting to be the noun, but not wanting to participate in the verb so much. So, you know, it's kind of like, well, how do I become a writer? How do I become a printer? And it's like, well, I don't know. I don't know what those things are. I mean, if it's got capital letters, it's probably of no use to you. It's not really the thing. It's, you know, the proper nouns are all ornamental in some ways, but the real work resides in the work. It resides in the showing up, understanding what you're trying to accomplish and applying yourself towards it. So invest in the verb, you know, and, you know, the nouns are nice, but invest in the verb.
I do definitely remember starting out at Massey, Nelson Adams, who was the college printer there, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago. It was almost sort of an initiation when students would sort of come along and poke their heads in and be interested in printing and what's going on in there. He would ask them to come back and he would put them to work vacuuming out type drawers, and which were always in really, really terrible shape.
It's a horrible job. Yeah.
It is. And certainly when I started there, I was a bit disappointed that that was the job that I was asked to do. And that the second time I went back, I was asked to do it again. And that the third time I went back, I was asked to do it again. And so I was sort of expecting to be allowed to do printing with the capital P, as you say, but Nelson had a really great sort of apprenticeship style plan in his mind, where you know, at first I understood it as paying your dues, but I over time understood that he was gradually teaching us about just all the different work that has to take place in a print shop in order for the actual, you know, printing that people like to see, in order for that to happen. And then after vacuuming the type cases, we would go on to oiling all of the presses. And so then you learn how all the different pieces fit together and so on. And so through that very gradual apprenticeship process, I think it was impossible not to gain an appreciation for the verb, as you say, for the work. And it was probably a good 6 months before I was able to actually set some time and print anything.
Nelson was a really great teacher, and I don't think he knew the extent to which he was a great teacher, because he, you know, he came to that late in life, and he just liked being difficult. You know, he liked to be grumpy, and he liked it. He liked that persona, you know, and so he leaned into it pretty hard a lot of the times. But it was a way, I think, of sorting through who the real people were, who are the people who were coming for an experience, you know, which is fine, but you can't invest a whole lot of people who are just there to pet the critters and see the sights. I mean, so it was his way of, I think, sorting out who the people who really wanted to be there were. And then slowly, gradually, without you even knowing it in some ways, you know, investing that love and time in teaching you about the thing that he loved.
Yeah, it was.
I really miss Nelson. He was a wonderful guy.
Likewise, absolutely. And I'm sure if there are some people attending today who also apprenticed at Massey, I'm sure that he's deeply missed by everyone. And so one other sort of thing that I wanted to ask you about is students often, I don't know if you have students actually helping you out in your shop. Do you have people who you sort
No,
of
I
hire?
don't like help.
No.
I'd like to, I'd like to like carry my own water, you know?
Right. Well, with the volunteers that we had at Massey and with the program that we hope to start at McGill, something that I've been thinking about is, if probably less than 1% of the people who come through these print shops will go on to become actual printers. And so what are the lessons, or what are the things that we want them to learn from the act of doing some hands-on printing that will serve them in the rest of their lives, and not just if they become printers?
Oh, there's so many things. I mean, at the core of it, though, I think like so much that happens in libraries and in rare book collections, it's about getting people to just pay attention, like to look around. I didn't really grow up in libraries and art galleries and such. I mean, I grew up at a sort of rural upbringing, and those kinds of amenities we saw as being for a different class of people. So, the woods was my teacher ultimately, and my grandparents and my parents were my teachers in terms of how to be in the world. And when I finally did sort of end up going to university, I went to the University of Ottawa, and of course, that's a town full of wonderful museums and archives and galleries. And so I started going to the art gallery on a regular basis when it was free on Thursdays, and walking around the main collection at the National Gallery, because I just thought, well, there's got to be something to this. Like, maybe I can learn something. And I discovered that it got better if you stopped in a room and you sat down and you just stayed there and you paid attention. So I started going and staying in a room for an afternoon. And sometimes I tried to sketch, and sometimes I would just watch people, and sometimes I would just look at the art. And, that was a skill I learned from the woods. If you just go plowing through the woods at a good clip to get from point A to point B, you're not going to see anything. But if you stop and you wait and you're patient, like the world comes to you. Like you start to notice things. You blend in. And I think the same is true of libraries and archives and so on. And so learning to be curious, learning to ask questions, learning how to solve puzzles, with presses in particular, it's like 100% all about the problem solving side of your brain. The kind of like artistic side is such a small piece. It's, it's a good piece, but it's a small one. And so when you're teaching students to print on a hand press in particular, it's all there. It's all laid out in front of you. There's like a dozen things, a dozen variables. And if you, ink it, pull a proof and look at it, it doesn't work, you've got like a dozen parts to push and pull at and figure out which needs to be different, So it's very, that hands-on problem solving element, I think is huge, particularly when you're with hand presses, in terms of something that you send people away with, even if they're never going to print another sheet again. What are some things that you found in that front in terms of students?
Well, I certainly what you say about just sort of being curious and taking the time to know, it's slowing down a bit and taking the time to notice what's going on around you is such I think an important thing to foster in our day and age, when we're constantly rushing around trying to get lots of things done, answering emails, looking at our phones constantly. There's just so many social media things dinging at you all the time. We're sort of inundated with all of this stimuli. And one of the things that I've found that students really seem to appreciate about working in the print shop is that usually they have to put away their phones and be away from the dinging for a few hours, and doing something like distributing type is the sort of thing that's tactile, that's practical, that has a defined beginning and an end and a sense of accomplishment when you've actually finished your task. And most of all, it's something where you need to have just enough, you need to pay just enough attention that you can't let your mind wander. You can't be sort of watching TV at the same time. But it's not so complicated that it starts to hurt your brain. So students tend to say that it's a very meditative sort of act, just putting pieces of type back into their compartments in a drawer. And it's not something that I would have expected to hear from modern students, but it's something that I think serves a really valuable purpose, not only to connect them to the past and to the labor that was involved in printing the books that they're studying, but to give them the opportunity to experience something like that, something tactile, and to have that sort of a calm in their daily lives that they don't otherwise find easily.
It teaches them to expect something too, like that you have to plan, you have to, like when you start, you have to know what you want it and need it to look like.
Mhm.
And think about how all the materials contribute to that. Because, you know, I, like everybody else, the first time I set up something, you know, in 18-point type and set a paragraph, and then you pull a proof, and you're like, oh, that looks great, except it needs to be smaller. Like, where's the Control Z? Oh no, I have to put it all away and start over again. So you have to develop this faculty for projecting, you know, like anticipating what the future is going to be, what the results of those pieces when you combine them will be. And because you have all these moving parts, not just on the press, but also what is the impact of using this paper versus that paper? What is the impact of using black ink versus a colored ink? And you have to be able to, it's not that you always know, but you have to kind of take an educated guess. You have to plan. And you know, some projects are fun when you don't plan. Like, that's the point, you know, like that's okay too. But it's such, I do, when I think about skills that are useful that people take away, I think that kind of learning to expect something, you know, and then having to work for it to earn it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that sort of brings us around to the one of the last topics I wanted to chat with you about. In another essay in your book, Smoke Proofs, you talk about the idea of a library, and specifically the rare book library and archives, as a workbench. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Particularly for me as a book designer and as an editor, you know, you don't, like, I mean, geographically, I work in isolation, but ultimately, you know, if you're working in culture, you're never working in isolation, because you're working both with those who are contemporary to you, and you're working with those who worked before you, and you're in some ways working with those who will come after you. So you are in this really big continuum. You are involved in this wonderful context. And one of the places where you go do that homework of learning where you are, part of the global positioning system, you know, for a creative person working with words, is the library, right? That's where the good stuff is. That's where you can go and look and see, you know, how, like, not just to measure yourself against it, but to just absorb it, to like, you know, to be in a library is like lying on your back in a stream on a summer's day and just taking it in, you know. It's just such a treat. So particularly for me, the collection here at Acadia University, which for a small school has some surprisingly good stuff in it. Like, who expected I could go down the street and there'd be a Nuremberg Chronicle, right? Holy cow. But also, you know, at the Fisher in particular, and at Massey College, were places that I've just put in a lot of time soaking up what there was to see. And when, you know, I'm a self-trained printer and book designer, I really didn't have something as wonderful as Massey College, you know, to get introduced. I just kind of jumped in. And so looking at books and looking at old books in particular has been so important, just to see, well, you know, what works, what doesn't work, what are the things that we dropped that we should be bringing back that could be useful in the contemporary context. It was just so useful, and I've encountered so many generous and helpful archivists and librarians over the years. It's just, I don't know, I'm very grateful.
I'm so glad that you've had such a fruitful experience in libraries so far. And I think this really speaks to the fact that especially, well, all libraries, but especially special collections, historical materials, it really reinforces how important it is for these priceless historical works to be available to the public, and not just to be sort of kept under lock and key, or to be viewed in a more museum type context through glass. Actually being able to sit down at a table and to feel the pages on that Nuremberg Chronicle is such an important experience, not only to connect someone to the past, but to learn about physically how the book as an object was created.
Yeah, and some of these materials are fragile, but the majority of them are quite robust. I mean, they were built to last, and they were built to be used. And that doesn't mean, I ran a long time guerrilla fight with some allies in the library here at Acadia of trying to get things off the stacks and into the, the always limited space of the rare book collection. And a good friend of mine by the name of Joe Steeves, who's recently passed away, he and I ran this sort of long-standing guerrilla activity of him finding things and then getting me to point them out because they would listen to me. But so we it's always.
Sorry, automatic lights in the library turn off.
Oh, is that what that was? Yeah, I'm melting. She's melting.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, I was so amused I lost my train of thought.
Well, I'm glad that you do that, because that happens quite often here at McGill as well. Sometimes we're shocked to see that, a book from the early 19th century is still sitting on the open stacks, and we're thankful when people bring them to our attention, so that, especially if they're in good shape, I think it's fine to leave them there. But if they're starting to deteriorate a bit, or
if they have an association or a value, like, so one of the things, I mean, a person can only understand and can so much, we all have limited processing power and memory. So I had a particular range of things I understood about that I could, they were never going to put a Kelmscott book out on the stacks, but I would find, reasonably rare, things that had been issued in edition a little too large for their definition, because you got to have cutoffs, but and yet I would find a sort of a none such publication, that was a uncommon or rare, or had an association, or had a signature in it, and I understood what it was. So the ability to sort of go to a sympathetic librarian and say, I don't know that you know this, but look at this, and maybe this needs a different situation, and that's the value I think that we all can bring. We can bring what we know. We can bring what we've experienced, what we've read, what we understand, and contribute to that job that is all of ours. The culture, right?
What is there a particular printer or fine press from the past that you find particularly informs your aesthetic in the work you do now?
Oh, certainly None Such Press was an influence, simply because they were people who were using all of the best tools and modern tools like monotype casters, which at the time the fine press movement was sort of would poo-poo mechanical typesetting, linotypes and monotypes. But that press was, it brought good design to more contemporary objects. Penguin was the same in the early days. Certainly these were influences. In some ways, they interest me a lot more than those, someone like William Morris, who was making very deluxe, items for the well-to-do, which is a sort of funny thing for a socialist to do. Really. He was a complicated guy. But more recently, certainly, I have a great admiration for William Reuter and the Aliquando Press. Will's been a friend, from very early on in my work, and his kind of riotous sense of color has always been, made me braver. Certainly in terms of combining colors and different types, and I'd say probably one of the printers I admire most of all is a guy named Gray Zeitz, who runs Larkspur Press in Kentucky, and he publishes his neighbors, people like Wendell Berry and Guy Davenport, Ed McClanahan, and just local Kentucky people. And he started in the 70s, and he was trained by Carolyn Hammer, who was a fine press printer and a hand press printer. And Gray has made his career, like literally fed himself by printing, hand setting books, printing them on a Chandler and Price platen press on basic papers and basic bindings, and selling them for prices that are more than a normal trade book, but not out of anyone's reach, and in open editions. So I admire him because he's still using these, what we think of as rarefied tools, to do the everyday job they were invented to do, just make stuff and to get it out to the people.
Right.
And on that note, I'd also mention Amos Kennedy, who's a good friend, is a poster printer in Detroit, very much uses printing for social activist causes. He's known for basically for bad printing, for just crazy riotous wood type posters that are sloppy and crazy and all over the place. And I can't really, in our present time, I can't think of any letterpress printers had a bigger influence on the next generation than Amos. But I admire his work ethic, and I admire the fact that he understands what printing is for.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he's found a way to connect what he does to the present moment. It's not some rarefied thing. We all sit around with our cognacs or whatever and talk about how much dwell we should have on. No, it's none of that nonsense. It's just down to work, making real things for people to use that are beautiful in the sense of that well-hung door.
Mm-hmm. That's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you. And for anyone who doesn't know Amos Kennedy's work, I encourage you to check it out. I think I'm noticing the time, and I think this is when we have decided to turn it over to questions from the chat. Jacquelyn, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yes, absolutely. So yes, this is the moment. If you have questions that you want to put to Lauren and Andrew, please do put them in the chat. I know I have a couple of my own to kick us off. I did notice as you were shifting around on screen there a little bit, Andrew, over one of your shoulders, I think I spy a very, very large R. Is that in fact related to the very large R that in the edition that Anne-Marie showed at the beginning of the event? And my question grew out of that photo, but now that I see it over your shoulder while you were having this conversation, can you tell us more about putting that particular spread together? Because that is an astonishing type size.
Yeah, that spread, when I cleaned out Glenn Goluska's shop after he died, that R, that big wood type R, was the only character from that font he'd had. And he was a real pack rat. I'm sure he picked that up at a flea market or somewhere. And someone had often what happens with wood type and other things is that gets broken up by antique dealers, and you'll buy an A or you'll buy a Z because it's your initial, and so these things get broken up. So he had this R that he'd gotten somewhere, and he had hung on his wall. So I took it down as part of the collection, and I was sort of eyeing it through the whole printing of that project and thinking, I've got to think of where to use that R. And it was so big it didn't fit on a single page. So I printed across a spread as the opening spread of my introductory essay.
And the follow-up question also from me is, what point size is that? Is that something that you measure? And the comparison between the two. So your essay on the page sits at the bottom, and the R takes up the spread.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't have that off the top of my head, but in wood type, I don't know. People are always having to invent a new system to feel special, maybe. But in wood type, you don't talk about point size. You talk about lines. So a line is a pica, and a pica is 12 points. So that would be described as 80 line or something. I don't know what it is, but it's big. It's more than that probably.
I also noticed that on that big R, that you can see very little of the sort of the grain of the wood. There's not much of that characteristic sort of unevenness. What is that, because of the wood that he used, or is it just in
No, it's because of my skill as a printer. No, I like some of the prints in that specimen. I was intentionally letting things just do their thing and be wild, and letting those imperfections come through. But some spreads, and that big R was one of them, I was hell-bent on getting that was just saturated. There was just so much ink. I probably went through a half pound of red ink, like printing those. It's just so much ink. So much.
Now, one of the comments in the chat was talking about the durability of paper, and you were talking about books as printed objects, and you look at your own, you see yourself reflected in the books that you make, and they're built to last, as you said, which is a beautiful concept. I'll use the word beautiful carefully here. But my question is, in your process in creating books today, the paper that you choose is an important choice, of course, but is paper today, does it have the same shelf life as something that was made in the 19th century? Has paper changed? Like, are your choices limited by what we have today, or are your choices empowered by what we have today?
Good paper is still available, ranging from handmade paper that's every bit as good as anything that's ever been made. And the handmade paper is sort of like the gold standard because you have long grain fibers and they're crossed, so they don't have a grain direction, and they can be really, really strong papers. So Saint Armand, for example, in Montreal is a wonderful handmade paper operation, and they make, some of my books use their paper, their handmade papers, and they're going to last so much longer than me. So that's where the analogy of seeing myself in the books breaks down, because I'm not going to last near as long. And you can buy bad papers, like the more recycled content you have in paper, generally, the less shelf life it will have. But even in our trade books, we use a virgin fiber, quality paper that is, pH balanced, So there was a really bad stretch in paper making in the 19th century, when they groundwood pulp and such, were sort of like more common when they were using the early days of using chemicals to break down the wood fiber, and no one really thought about what it was going to do, and now like some of those books, that are in your collection, you turn a page and it just sort of disintegrates in your hands. But that was a period. But certainly there is good paper available today.
Yeah. Now, and tying back once again to some of the slides that Anne-Marie showed at the beginning, she showed a number of these specimen sheets in our collections. And I noticed behind you that there are a lot of drawers. Is a specimen sheet, is that something that your shop produces today? Is that something that's still used by an active working print shop like yours, or is that something that's an artifact of a previous time?
It's not used as, certainly now that most print shops are functioning in the digital realm. And that type is everywhere, it's not as common to see specimen books. It's actually quite rare. And I actually just did a digital font specimen for a company called Canada Type for the Goluska typeface that Rod McDonald designed in honor of Glenn Goluska. And they've just released that typeface in the past couple of weeks. But for them to hire me to produce a specimen was a very uncommon thing. It doesn't happen anymore. But even in terms of my own metal type collection, I have, done a specimen of the wood type, but I have not gone through and done specimens of in a formal way, all of my metal type. It would just take too much time.
You've got a lot on the shelves behind you.
I do have a pretty good run of informal specimens. As you go along, you like throw a copy in the drawer anytime you use something, and that way you can go back and show a client or an author, or just make reference yourself and see, well, what does 12-point Jansen look like on 13-point leading, or should it be 14-point leading? You can actually look and see, and so you're saving a step in the guessing.
So they are useful to you, the samples.
Yeah.
We're just about out of time there. It's 6:30. So I'm going to say a few thank yous. An enormous one to you, Andrew, and to Lauren for sharing your thoughts with us. And really, there were some very cute quotable moments in there, some which were captured in the chat. And I think the image that really stays with me is the image of the library as floating on your back in a summer stream. That one has some legs, and we'll run with it. So thank you for sharing your thoughts and your practice, and such really deep words and thoughts about the process of printing and the value of solidly made objects and well-hung doors. So thank you for that. Thank you too to Anne-Marie for the introduction to the collections. And I do invite anyone who's interested in consulting things in the collection, you can email us and book an appointment to look at these examples in person. And you can see that enormous letter R, for instance, in the beautiful work that in Latin, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce, but it's there and it's a great teaching tool. So an enormous thank you to you. Thank you too to the behind the scenes help, Labiba, for helping manage the Zoom event. And thanks to all of you for coming. It's these aren't possible without people to share ideas with. So we thank our supporters, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and to private donors who make our events possible, Ron Harvey and Doug Bagley. And to all of you for coming, thanks very much. Our next event is the last one of the term, and it's taking place on December 15th. It's called Show and Tell, The Secrets of Women. It'll be a bilingual event, Montrer et raconter les secrets des femmes, with a show and tell from our collection. So if you want another taste of it, you can tune in then. The other way to tune in and take home a little bit of printing with you is to take home or purchase your copy of Amaze. This is a book we produced. And P in our book, of course, stands for printing. So there's a nice surprise that will jump off the page for you when you pick up your own copy. You can get those from the bookstore or from our site as well. You can email us to find out more about that. So an enormous thank you to all of you for coming, and we hope to see you again, if not next week, at some of our events in the new year. So thanks from Montreal, and good
Thank
night.
you, everybody. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you. Take care.